everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. It is me, Dr. Megan, although I am here with my silly hair again because I decided I really liked it. So, silly hair Megan is here for the foreseeable future, I suppose. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about something exciting that is happening, actually a couple of exciting things that are happening that I've not been paid by anyone to say, but the first is today, Andy Serkis is reading the entirety of The Hobbit online for a fundraiser he calls the Hobbit-a-thon COVID-19 response. And he has a GoFundMe that you can find, and all donations go to support charities in the UK that are helping with the coronavirus response there. So if you're like me and you absolutely love the book The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, it would be great if you could go over, maybe watch the Andy Serkis reading, and possibly consider giving a donation. The other thing that I wanted to make sure everybody knew was that every week, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter will be having a guest reader read a chapter from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone if you're in Britain. So there are readers like Michelle Obama, Stephen Fry, David Beckham, Daniel Radcliffe reads the first chapter. I've watched the video and it is delightful. So that is something to also look forward if you ever get tired of me reading to you. So those are just a couple things that I wanted to mention before I got into the readings today. Today we are reading a wonderful 1964 classic called Whistle for Willie by Ezra Jack Keats. This is a used library copy that I got off Better World Books, so it, has seen better days, but it's a beautiful book, and I'm really excited to share it with you because Willie is a dachshund, and I also have a dachshund whom I adore, so this book is a lot of fun for me. So, let's read Whistle for Willie by Ezra Jack Keats together. Whistle for Willie by Ezra Jack Keats. Oh, how Peter wished he could whistle. This is Peter. He saw a boy playing with his dog. Whenever the boy whistled, the dog would run straight towards him. Peter tried and tried to whistle, but couldn't. So instead, he began to turn himself around, around and around and around he whirled, faster and faster. When he stopped, everything turned down and up and up and down and around and around. Peter saw his dog Willie coming. Wouldn't it be funny? Shh, that is not Willie, but that is a dog. Quick as a wink, he hid in an empty carton lying on the sidewalk. Wouldn't it be funny if I whistled? Peter thought. Willie would stop and look all around to see who it was. Peter tried again to whistle, but he still couldn't. So Willie just walked on. Here is Willie. Peter got out of the carton and started home. On the way home, he took some colorful chalk out of his pocket and drew a long, long line. Right up to his door. He stood there and tried to whistle again. He blew till his cheeks were tired, but nothing happened. And I tried to do that too. It's like, but no whistle. He went into the house and put on his father's old hat to make himself feel more grown up. He looked into the mirror to practice whistling. Still, no whistle. When his mother saw what he was doing, Peter pretended that he was his father. He said, I've come home early today, dear. Is Peter here? His mother shook her head. Why, no, he's outside with Willie. Well, I'll go out and look for them, said Peter. First, he walked along a crack in the sidewalk. Then he tried chasing his shadow. He jumped off his shadow, but when he landed, they were together again. He came to the corner where the curtain was, and who should be there but Willie? Peter scrambled under the curtain. He blew and blew and blew. Suddenly, out came a whistle. Willie stopped and looked around to see who it was. "It's me!" Peter shouted and stood up. Willie raced straight to him. Peter ran home to show his mother and father what he could do. They loved Peter's whistling, and so did Willie. Peter's mother asked him and Willie to go on an errand to the grocery store. He whistled all the way there, and he whistled all the way home. The end. So that is Whistle for Willie by Ezra Jack Keats. He also wrote a book called The Snowy Day, which I have on order, but it has not gotten here yet. So I will read that sometime in the coming weeks. I have many children's books that just arrived. The Day the Crayons Quit, something called The Library Lion, which I'm very excited about, Madeline, and a couple of other ones. So we will have plenty of material for the next couple of weeks. Now, we will read a chapter, as always, from our Paddington Treasury. So last time we read about Paddington becoming an accidental barber, which did not work out super well haircut-wise, but did work out very well for his friend, Mr. Gruber. And today we are reading a chapter called A Visit to the Bank. "Paddington looks unusually smart this morning," said Mrs. Bird. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "Does he? I hope he's not up to anything." She joined Mrs. Bird at the window and followed the direction of her gaze up to the road to where a small figure in a blue duffel coat was hurrying along the pavement. Now that Mrs. Bird mentioned it, Paddington did seem to have an air about him. Even from a distance, his fur looked remarkably neat and freshly combed, and his old hat, instead of being pulled down over his ears, was set at a very rakish angle with the brim turned up, which was most unusual. Even his old suitcase looked as if it had had some kind of polish on it. "He's not even going in his usual direction," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington, having reached the end of the road, looked carefully over his shoulder and then turned right and disappeared from view. "He always turns left." "If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, "that young bear's got something on his mind. He was acting strangely at breakfast this morning. He didn't even have a second helping, and he kept peering over Mr. Brown's shoulder at the paper with a very odd look at his face." "I'm not surprised he had an odd look if it was Henry's paper," said Mrs. Brown. "I never can make head nor tail of it myself." Mr. Brown worked in the City of London, and he always read a very important newspaper over breakfast, full of news about stocks and shares and other money matters, which the rest of the Browns found very dull indeed. "All the same," she continued as she led the way into the kitchen, "it's very strange. I do hope he hasn't got one of his ideas coming on. He spent most of yesterday doing his accounts, and that's often a bad sign." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird were hard at work preparing for the coming holiday, and with only a few days left, there are 1,001 things to be done. If they hadn't been quite so busy, they might well have put two and two together, but as it was, the matter of Paddington's strange behavior was soon forgotten in the rush to get everything ready. Unaware of the interest he had caused, Paddington made his way along a road not far from the Portobello Market until he reached an imposing building which stood slightly apart from the rest. It had tall bronze doors which were tightly shut, and over the entrance in large gold letters were the words "Floyd's Bank Limited." After carefully making sure that no one was watching, Paddington withdrew a small cardboard-covered book from under his hat and then sat down on his suitcase outside the bank while he waited for the doors to open. Like the building, the book had the words "Floyd's Bank" printed on the outside, and just inside the front cover it had "P. Brown, Esquire" written in ink. With the exception of the Browns and Mr. Gruber, not many people knew about Paddington's bank account, as it was a closely kept secret. It had all started some months before when Paddington came across an advertisement in one of Mr. Brown's old newspapers, which he cut out and saved. In a very fatherly-looking man smoking a pipe, who said he was Mr. Floyd, explained how any money left with him would earn what he called interest, and that the longer he kept it, the more it would be worth. Paddington had an eye for a bargain, and having his money increased simply by leaving it somewhere, it sounded like a very good bargain indeed. The Browns had been so pleased at the idea that Mr. Brown had given him 50 pence to add to his Christmas and birthday money, and after a great deal of thought, Paddington had himself added another 10 pence, which he had carefully saved from his weekly bun allowance. When all these sums were added together, they made a grand total of £5 and 25 pence, and one day Mrs. Bird had taken him along to the bank in order to open an account. For several days afterwards, Paddington had hung about in a shop doorway opposite, casting suspicious glances at anyone who went in or out. But after having been moved on by a passing policeman, he'd had to let matters rest. Since then, although he had carefully checked the amount in his book several times, Paddington had never actually been inside the bank. Secretly, he was rather overawed by all the marble and thick polished wood, so he was pleased when at long last 10 o'clock began to strike on a nearby church clock, and he was still the only one outside. As the last of the chimes died away, there came the sound of bolts being drawn on the other side of the door, and Paddington hurried forward to peer eagerly through the letter-box. "'Ere, 'ere!" exclaimed the porter as he caught sight of Paddington's hat through the slit. "No loiterers here, young feller. This is a bank, not a workhouse. We don't want no layabouts hanging around here." "Layabouts?" repeated Paddington, letting go of the letter-box flap in his surprise. "That's what I said," grumbled the porter as he opened the door. "Breathing all over me knockers. I has to polish that brass, you know." "I am not a layabout," exclaimed Paddington, looking most offended as he waved his bank book in the air. "I'm a bear, and I've come to see Mr. Floyd about my savings." "Oh dear," said the porter, taking a closer look at Paddington. "Begging your pardon, sir. When I saw your whiskers poking through me letterbox, I mistook you for one of them bearded gentlemen of the road." "That's all right," said Paddington sadly. "I often get mistaken." And as the man held the door open for him, he raised his hat politely and hurried into the bank. On several occasions in the past, Mrs. Bird had impressed upon Paddington how wise it was to have money in the bank in case of a rainy day, and also how glad he might be to have it there for one day for a special occasion. Thinking things over in bed the night before, Paddington had decided that going abroad for a holiday was certainly very much a special occasion, and after studying the advertisement once again, he had thought up a very good idea for having the best of both worlds. But like many ideas he had had before at night under the bedclothes, it didn't seem like quite such a good one in the cold light of day. Now that he was actually inside the bank, Paddington began to feel rather guilty, and he wished he'd consulted Mr. Gruber on the matter, for he wasn't at all sure that Mrs. Bird would approve of his taking any money out without first asking her. And here is Paddington in the bank. Hurrying across to one of the tellers at the counter, Paddington climbed up on his suitcase and peered over the edge. The man on the other side looked rather startled when Paddington's hat appeared over the top, and he reached nervously for a nearby alarm bell. "I'd like to take out all my savings for a special occasion, please," said Paddington importantly as he handed the man his accounts book. Looking rather relieved, the man took Paddington's book from him and then raised one eyebrow as he held it up to the light. There were a number of calculations in red ink all over the cover, not to mention blots and one or two rather messy-looking marmalade stains. "I'm afraid I had an accident with one of my jars under the bedclothes last night," exclaimed Paddington hastily as he caught the man's eye. "One of your jars?" said the man. "Under the bedclothes?" "That's right," said Paddington. "I was working out my interest, and I stepped back into it by mistake. It's a bit difficult under the bedclothes." "It must be," said the man distastefully. "Marmalade stains, indeed. And on a Floyd's bank book." He hadn't been with the branch for very long, and although the manager had told him they sometimes had some very odd customers to deal with, nothing had been mentioned about Bear's bank accounts. "What would you like me to do with it?" he asked doubtfully. "I'd like to leave all my interest in, please," explained Paddington, "in case it rains." "Well," said the man in a superior tone of voice as he made some calculations on a piece of paper, "I'm afraid you won't keep very dry on this. It only comes to 10 pence." "What?" exclaimed Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. 10 pence? I don't think that's very interesting at all. Interest is not the same as interesting, said the man. Not the same thing at all. He tried hard to think of some way of explaining matters, for he wasn't used to dealing with bears, and he had a feeling that Paddington was going to be one of his more difficult customers. It's something we give you for letting us borrow your money, he said. The longer you leave it in, the more you get. Doggies. The garbage man is here, so the dogs are keeping me safe. Well, my money's been in since just after Christmas, explained Paddington. That's nearly 6 months. Guys! 10 pence, said the man finally. Paddington watched in a daze as the man made an entry in his book and then pushed a 5-pound note and some silver across the counter. There you are, he said briskly. £5.25. Paddington looked suspiciously at the note and then consulted a piece of paper he held in his paw. His eyes grew larger and larger as he compared the two. I think you... Guys, it's fine. Guys! Shh, it's fine. Paddington looked suspiciously at the note and then consulted a piece of paper he held in his paw. His eyes grew larger and larger as he compared the two. I think you must have made a mistake, he said. This isn't my note. A mistake? Said the man stiffly. We of Floyd's never make mistakes. But it's got a different number, said Paddington hotly. A different number? Said the man. Yes, said Paddington, and it said on mine that you promised to pay Bear £5 on demand. Not Bear, said the teller. Bearer. It says that on all notes. Besides, he continued, you don't get the same note back that you put in. I expect yours is miles away by now, if it's anywhere at all. It might even have been burned if it was an old one. They often burn old notes when they're worn out. Burned? Repeated Paddington in a dazed voice. You've burned my note? I didn't say it had been, said the man, looking more and more confused. I only said it might have been. Paddington took a deep breath and gave the teller a hard stare. It was one of the extra special hard ones, which Aunt Lucy had taught him and which he kept for emergencies. I think I should like to see Mr. Floyd, he exclaimed. Mr. Floyd? Repeated the teller. He mopped his brow nervously as he looked anxiously over Paddington's shoulder at the line that was already beginning to form. There was some nasty murmurings going on at the back that he didn't like the sound of at all. I'm afraid there isn't a Mr. Floyd, he said. We have a Mr. Trimble, he said hastily, as Paddington gave him an even harder stare. He's the manager. I think perhaps I'd better fetch him. He'll know what to do. Paddington stared indignantly after the retreating figure of the teller as he made his way toward a door marked manager. The more he saw of things, the less he liked the look of them. Not only did his note have a different number, but he had just caught sight of the dates on the coins, and they were quite different from those on the ones he had left. Apart from that, his own coins had been highly polished, whereas these were old and very dull. Paddington climbed down off his suitcase and pushed his way through the crowd with a determined expression on his face. Although he was only small, Paddington was a bear with a strong sense of right and wrong, especially when it came to money matters, and he felt it was high time he took matters into his own hands. After he had made his way out of the bank, Paddington hurried down the road in the direction of a red phone booth. Locked away in the secret compartment of his suitcase, there was a note with some special instructions that Mrs. Bird had written out for him in case of an emergency, together with 10 pence. Thinking things over as he went along, Paddington decided it was very much a matter of an emergency. In fact, he had a job to remember when he'd had a bigger one, and he was glad when at long last the telephone booth came into view and he saw it was empty. I don't know what's going on at the bank this morning, said Mrs. Brown as she closed the front door. There was an enormous crowd outside when I came past. Perhaps there's been a robbery, said Mrs. Brown. You read of such nasty goings on these days. I don't think it was a robbery, said Mrs. Bird vaguely. It was more like an emergency of some kind. The police were there, and an ambulance and the fire brigade. Said Mrs. Bird. Well, I hope for all of our sakes it isn't anything serious. Paddington's got all his money there, and if there has been a raid, we shall never hear the last of it. Mrs. Bird paused as she was speaking, and a thoughtful expression came over her face. Talking of Paddington, have you seen him since he went out? She asked. No, said Mrs. Brown. Good heavens, she exclaimed. You don't think... I'll get my hat, said Mrs. Bird, and if Paddington's not somewhere at the bottom of it, I'll eat it all on the way home. It took Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird some time to force their way through the crowd into the bank, and when they at last got inside, their worst suspicions were realized, for there, sitting on his suitcase in the middle of a large crowd of officials, was the small figure of Paddington. What on earth's going on? Cried Mrs. Brown as they pushed their way through to the front. Paddington looked very thankful to see the others. Things had been going from bad to worse since he'd gotten back to the bank. I think my numbers have gotten mixed up by the make, Mrs. Brown, he exclaimed. Trying to do a young bear out of his life savings, that's what's going on, cried someone at the back. Set fire to his money, they did, cried someone else. Hundreds of pounds gone up in smoke, so they say, called out a street trader who knew Paddington by sight and had come into the bank to see what all the fuss was about. Oh dear, said Mrs. Brown nervously. I'm sure there must be a mistake. I don't think Floyd's would ever do a thing like that on purpose. Indeed not, madam, exclaimed the manager as he stepped forward. My name's Trimble, he continued. Can you vouch for this young bear? Vouch for him? Said Mrs. Bird. Why, I brought him here myself in the first place. He's a most respectable member of the family and very law-abiding. Respectable he may be, said a large policeman as he licked his pencil, but I don't know so much about being law-abiding. Dialing the emergency number he was without proper cause, calling out the police, not to mention the fire brigade and an ambulance. It'll all have to be gone into in the proper manner. Everyone stopped talking and looked down at Paddington. I was only trying to call Mrs. Bird, said Paddington. Trying to call Mrs. Bird, said the policeman slowly as he wrote it down in his notebook. That's right, explained Paddington. I'm afraid it's a bit difficult with paws to do one number at a time, so I just kept pressing and hoping for the best. Mr. Trimble coughed. I think perhaps we had better go into my office, he said. It all sounds most complicated, and it's much quieter in there. With that, everyone agreed wholeheartedly, and Paddington, as he picked up his suitcase and followed the others into the manager's office, agreed most of all. Having a bank account was quite the most complicated thing he had ever come across. It was some time before Paddington finally got through his explanations, but when he had finished, everyone looked most relieved that the matter wasn't more serious. Even the policeman seemed quite pleased. It's a pity there aren't more public-spirited bears about, he said, shaking Paddington by the paw. If everyone called for help when they saw anything suspicious, we'd have a lot less work to do in the long run. After everyone else had left, Mr. Trimble took Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Bird, and Paddington on a tour of the vault to show them where all the money was kept, and he even gave Paddington a book of instructions so that he would know exactly what to do the next time he paid the bank a visit. I do hope you won't close your account, Mr. Brown, he said. We of Floyd's never like to feel we're losing a valued customer. If you like to leave your 25 pence with us for safekeeping, I'll let you have a brand new £5 note to take away for your holidays. Paddington thanked Mr. Trimble very much for all his trouble, and then considered the matter. If you don't mind, he said at last, I think I'd like a used one instead. Paddington wasn't the sort of bear who believed in taking any chances, and although the crisp new note in the manager's hand looked very tempting, he decided he would much prefer to have one that had been properly tested. So here is Paddington with his properly tested banknote. The end. So today is Friday, which means I will be not reading tomorrow or Sunday, but I will be back Monday with another book and another section of Paddington. We are now well over halfway through the Paddington Treasury, so I will have to consider another chapter book. But we will have things to read for sure. So in the meantime, enjoy your day, enjoy your weekend, try to do something fun, and take good care of yourselves. Bye!